With every peace talk, Israel has cemented its occupation.
Jerusalem is not a settlement, it's our capital.
Crushing dreams of peace and Palestinian statehood. My guest tonight, however, thinks old maps,
the Jewish state coloured light, the Arab state dark,
can still create new borders. But is he stuck in the past? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Norman Finkelstein. A controversial figure, he's the author of several books including The Holocaust Industry and How to Solve the Israel-Palestine Conflict. Norman, your new book is called How to Solve the Israel-Palestine Conflict. Given the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, is the latest person to have tried and failed to do so, what makes you think that you have the solution to this conflict?
Well, first of all, Secretary of State Kerry did not try to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict in a way that's reasonable for both sides. He's basically, or has been basically, trying to impose the Israeli position on the Palestinians. My own view is there's a reasonable possibility for solving the conflict. There's enough international support for it. There's enough popular support for it. And now the key is for the Palestinians themselves to mobilize in favor of that international consensus.
Which is?
Basically, it's what's been for the past 30 years. It's two states in the June '67 border and what's called a just resolution of the refugee question.
The Palestinians, as you well know better than me, first said that they would back a two-state solution back in 1988. Since then, over the last quarter of a century, we've had the Madrid Conference, the Oslo Accords, the Wye River Memorandum, the Camp David Summit, the Tava Summit, the Roadmap, the Annapolis Conference, and lately, the John Kerry Plan. None of them managed to bring about a two-state solution, and yet you say that's the most likely option. In what fantasy world is this two-state solution ever going to happen?
There's a huge reservoir of support for the Palestinians, and the reservoir has now extended and includes, for example, I think, large segments of the American Jewish community, which has grown disaffected from the state of Israel, and there are real possibilities of reaching American Jews as well.
Let me read to you what Professor Rashid Khalidi of Columbia University, one of the world's leading Palestinian intellectuals, he says the two-state solution is now, quote, Wizard of Oz stuff, and that people on the pro-Palestinian side, like yourself, who still cling to a two-state solution, he says, quote, need to have their heads examined.
Well, if that were the case, then you'd have to say there's no possibility for any reasonable resolution of the conflict, because if the two-state settlement as it's supported by the international community, if that is Wizard of Oz stuff, then one state is man on the moon stuff. So you have two possibilities right now. There is the two states as has been embraced by the international community, and then there's what you might call at this point the Kerry initiative, namely imposing Israel's bottom line, the Palestinians. One state is not part of the debate.
Many people would argue that the two-state solution, yes, you can vote on it every year in the UN Assembly, you can win over American Jewish support, but the reality is that the facts on the ground have rendered it impossible, unviable. There are now too many Israeli settlements, too many Jewish settlers, too many Palestinians, all stuck living together in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and it's too late to disentangle. It's too late to unscramble the omelette.
The Palestinians, during what were called the Annapolis negotiations in May 2008, they did present what were, I would say, were very reasonable maps. They presented a map, for example, which showed Israel can keep 60% of the settlers in place, 60% of the settlers in place in 2% of the West Bank. And the Palestinian state would remain contiguous, it would remain a viable state.
So you genuinely believe that 500,000 heavily subsidized, heavily armed Israeli settlers, many of them religious fanatics, will just leave without a peep to bring about this two-state solution?
Absolutely not. They won't leave without a peep. And there you have to know the details. But Tzipi Livni, who was then the foreign minister, she was in charge of negotiations, she didn't deny it was a reasonable map. She said, it's not that your map is physically impossible. She said it was politically impossible. That is to say, no Israeli prime minister could support such a map and still remain in office. The problem is not one of physics, the problem is one of politics.
And Oliver Cam, who is a columnist and leader writer for the Times of London and for the Jewish Chronicle, and a US official told an Israeli newspaper a few months ago that the Kerry plan fell apart, quote, the primary sabotage came from the settlements, he says.
Yes, I'm not going to defend the settlements, but I don't think that the settlements per se are an obstacle to a two-state solution. One can perfectly well see with land swaps whereby 80% of the settlers remain in place, that there's the possibility of a two-state solution satisfying the national aspirations of both parties. And
do you think 80% of the settlers should be allowed to stay under your vision of a solution?
Well, again, you keep personalizing it and saying my vision of a solution.
You've co-authored a book called How to Solve the Israel-Palestine Conflict.
Right, but the proposals that were made by the Palestinians in Annapolis in 2008, they said about 60% of the settlers can remain in place. It'll change a little because now there are more settlers. Yeah, about 60% will stay in place, but then there are other possibilities and you have to keep them in mind. You mentioned correctly the large number of settlers there are being subsidized. And then you have to ask your question, what happens if the Israeli government ceases its subsidies? And then you have the fanatics, and that's true. And they asked one Israeli former security chief, well, what do you do about those fanatics? He says it's very simple. All you have to do is tell those crazy settlers in Hebron, if you want to stay, stay. But we're leaving, meaning the army is leaving.
And you're leaving this 400 Wizard of Oz stuff. It's never going to happen. No. The Israeli army is never going to abandon settlers.
Well, I don't know why you make that assumption. At the present moment, that's correct.
50 years of history.
At the present moment, that's correct because not very much pressure has been exerted on Israel. Israel has the first cost-free occupation in the history of humanity. Okay. The Palestinians do the dirty work, the Europeans pay the bills, and the United States blocks for them in the UN. So why should they leave?
Okay, well,
There's no incentive to leave.
Let's bring in Salma Karmi, who is a Palestinian lawyer and activist. What's your view? Are you someone who still wants to have that independent Palestinian state that so many Palestinians have said they wanted?
I think the one thing that we're overlooking in this whole discussion about the logistics of whether the two-state solution is practical or possible is whether it's actually desirable from the Palestinian point of view. I think the problem that people need to bear in mind is that the Palestinian problem that needs a solution isn't confined to those Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. So we need a solution that achieves rights for the Palestinian diaspora, for the refugees, and for those who are discriminated against in Israel. And the two-state solution patently doesn't do that. It's unfair because it only awards the Palestinians 20% of their historic homeland, and it doesn't actually address the wider issues which afflict the Palestinian population. So it's not right in principle and it's not workable.
What you want to look at is, in the broad public, in the international arena, what's the furthest you can go? And the furthest you can go, in my opinion, for now, is what you might call enlightened public opinion. And enlightened public opinion in the current world is mostly the language of international law, the language of human rights. So you look at the most representative organizations in the world today, and you look at what are their terms for resolving the conflict. They say two states.
Here's what I don't get with you, Norman. You're someone who called Israel a lunatic state. Yeah. You called President Obama a stupefying narcissist, devoid of any principles, every bit as wretched as his predecessors. You called the Palestinian Authority a gang of corrupt, wretched collaborators. And yet your solution to the conflict involves those corrupt collaborators doing a deal with that lunatic state under the supervision of a wretched, narcissistic president. How does that work?
Hey. I'm not so sure, those of you who are clapping, what would you have done during World War II? I'm no great fan of Winston Churchill. I think he was a monster in many ways. And what would you do with Mr. Stalin? But then you want to defeat the Nazis, and there was an alliance between Mr. Churchill and Mr. Stalin to defeat the Nazis. So what are you going to do? You're going to reject them both? And fine, then you'll have a Nazi rule in the world. You have to bring to bear pressure on the U.S. government. And I think there are real possibilities now. Israel's stock has dropped precipitously in the United States, not just broadly, but even the American Jewish community.
Norman, do you not see the contradiction then in your thinking? Because a few moments ago you told us, and you've told previous interviewers, that I work with the limits of public opinion, and yet you're telling us that shock horror public opinion changes. US Jewish public opinion changes. Public opinion changes all the time. Why can't people make a case to shape public opinion, to change public opinion, to get people on board? Why say, this is what the public in America thinks, and this is the only deal the Palestinians can get? Why outsource the resolution of the Palestinian conflict to US public opinion?
Well, I'm not outsourcing to U.S. public opinion. I think U.S. public opinion at this point is the weakest read. I think it's European public opinion is quite powerful, and I think it's quite feasible that you can win over not only European public opinion, but it's important to keep in mind also European governments. I mean, as we speak, European governments are putting enormous pressure on Israel now on the question of the settlements. But do you see any European government? Can you name me one European government that's even hinted at one state? Name me one European government. Forget it. Let's not mention European governments.
Name me one government.
Name me one government in the whole world. Has the Islamic Republic of Iran called for one state?
If you were around in the 1930s, what would you have said to Gandhi? You wrote a book about Gandhi. What would you have said to Mandela? Sorry, guys, give up the national liberation movement. Western public opinion isn't with you. Give up all of that national liberation stuff. Accept whatever Western public opinion gives you. It's a very defeatist posture.
You're just so way off base. It's unbelievable. You read Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi's standard was always where public opinion is. You don't go beyond public opinion.
Was public opinion in favor of an independent India in the 1930s? I don't think it was, Norman.
We were entering the era of decolonization. This was after World War I. And he said in that era, yes, that's something which is reachable, something within reach. He always calculated in terms of public opinion.
You told Salma that you've got to stick with the two-state solution because that is where the limits of public opinion are. And I'm saying that's not how the world works.
When I said public opinion, I did not limit myself to the United States. I said the United Nations. I said 165 countries have embraced this solution. The problem is they've only done it on paper. And the challenge is, how do you turn passive support into active support? And I think there I agree with Gandhi, the way you turn passive support, which exists, including in the American Jewish community, the way you turn it into active support is you have to have mass nonviolent resistance in the occupied territories, like the First Intifada, which was remarkably successful, although it was aborted. It was a very successful first undertaking.
Okay, our panel are agitated to come in. Jeff Halper, you wanted to come in.
Today, there is no traction to a one-state solution. The problem here is that we're thinking in a linear way. We're assuming that the status quo of today, the situation of today, is going to continue, and now how do we deal with it? This is a very dynamic situation. It's very likely, it's certainly possible, that the Palestinian Authority is going to leave the scene at some point. I mean, Abu Mazen himself is 80 years old. It could very well be that there'll be a political collapse if the Palestinian Authority leaves the scene, and Israel will have to reoccupy the Palestinian cities and maybe Gaza. Given a collapse, then that opens up possibilities for one-state solutions and other possibilities that don't exist today, which is true.
Do you support a one-state solution?
I support it, and I think it's very doable. And not only is it doable, but it's the only way out. But it's going to have to wait upon a collapse in which what we're talking about today becomes really irrelevant.